why it's also important for people in Britain to see that Bloody Sunday reveals something really, really fundamental about the nature of the British state. It's Bloody Sunday is often portrayed as something that's got something to do with this strange conflict that's been going on in the north of Ireland for hundreds and hundreds of years, and sort of flares up from time to time, and the British state is sort of called upon to stand, between these two irrational warring tribes, and sort of keep them apart until they settle down again. That's the standard narrative of Britain's involvement in Ireland. Bloody Sunday shows that that is a lie. The British state are at the heart of what the problem is in the north of Ireland. Bloody Sunday changed the whole direction of events in the north of Ireland for the next 30, 40 years. And that's why it's important for us to understand what it means for Ireland, but also what it means for our understanding about the British state that we're up against. If we're fighting for change here, we're up against that state, the same state that covers up about Orgreave, that covers up about Hillsborough, that covers up about Stephen Lawrence, that uses all those same lies and so on here. And that's why I want to try and go over. So I think it's important for everybody who's active in Britain to understand the real story of what happened on Bloody Sunday, and keep in mind the lessons and why it remains important. It's not just something confined to history 50 years ago. It's something that remains important to this day. As I say, the point about Bloody Sunday is not just that there were the killings. I mean, it's shocking, sort of what, and the whole weekend was full of people recounting stories of what they saw that day and what they witnessed. People like my father, people like my uncles, and so all that sort of stuff. Who were all there on the day. But it's not only that. The really significant thing about Bloody Sunday is that from the very beginning, from the very moment that the shooting ended, and the bodies were still being loaded into ambulances or got away in cars to try and get into hospitals and so on, the whole British establishment closed ranks around the army and engaged in a cover-up and engaged in lies, and they all stuck to that script for 38 years until it was overturned by mass protests and the Savile inquiry. What they claimed, as Kate mentioned, was that the soldiers came. I'm so sorry. Was that the soldiers came under fire the soldiers come under fire from people in the Bogside, and that everybody shot or wounded was carrying a gun or about to throw a nail bomb, at the army. Every single part of that was an elaborate lie. But that was the official account of Bloody Sunday, and it was repeated by army generals. It was repeated in the Parliament in the days afterwards by government ministers. It was sent out by the British Information Service to every embassy and consulate right around the world. It said, if you are asked questions about this, if there are protests outside your embassy and the media are on to this is the line that you have to give. This is what was done. It was also the truth was actually buried in a series of sympathetic press barons as well, who went quiet about this and suppressed the truth about Bloody Sunday. The Lord Chief Justice of Britain, Lord Widgery, was flown in a couple of weeks later, and amid the storm of protest that swept Ireland and around the world after Bloody Sunday, he was flown in a British Army helicopter to Coleraine. In order to conduct an inquiry which completely exonerated the army, said that they were justified in opening fire, completely accepted their account. And so the British government now says that the Savile inquiry, which overturned this 12-year-long inquiry, which finally dragged the British government to finally admit that everybody on Bloody Sunday was actually innocent, should be the end of the matter. That to ask for anything else, to ask for prosecution of the soldiers, to ask for prosecution of the generals, or the government ministers who discussed all this in the run-up to Bloody Sunday and covered it up afterwards, is really just to stir things up when we're all committed to the peace process now. And Boris Johnson in the Parliament the other day sort of said the future should be about reconciliation and peace and living together and so on, as if the problem with Bloody Sunday was somehow that people had fallen out with each other. Do you know what I mean? And that they needed to be brought together. And the reason we need to oppose this and support the continuing fight for justice is really, the Bloody Sunday it absolutely undermines that sort of narrative and really reveals the lengths to which the British state will go when it's threatened and its interests are threatened. You see, the paratroopers, the reason why the paratroopers were sent into Derry to come down in a horde on an area that had risen up against the rotten Northern Ireland state, a state which had presided over almost 5 decades of violence and religious discrimination against the Catholic minority in the north of Ireland over housing, employment and voting rights. Derry was at the epicentre of that. The mass civil rights movement, modelled on the civil rights movement in the United States, was taken to the streets to try and demand reform and try and demand equality. But it was met with extreme violence by the Northern Ireland police force, sort of a completely sectarianised police force. And then later, after police had been fought to a standstill in riots and an uprising in Derry in particular, known as the Battle of the Bogside in 1969, when for 3 days and nights, just stones and petrol bombs, they kept the police out of the area. That was a moment when the British Army was brought into the north of Ireland, because that RUC had lost control, and from then on, more and more the British Army, despite the government promising reforms, more and more the British Army became, sort of the front line and started acting in the same role as the RUC and cracking down on protests. The fact that people in the Bogside for the next 2 years really barricaded off their area, prevented the army and the police from coming into the area. It was absolutely outraged the Unionist government, outraged the loyalists like Ian Paisley, who were building a right-wing movement, sort of around them, outraged the higher echelons of the British state. Eamon McCann says that General Ford, the guy who ordered the parachute regiment into Derry in order to crack down on Bloody Sunday, he said when he was at the Savile inquiry, he was quivering with rage at the outrage that an area of the United Kingdom would seal itself off from the forces of the state, run the area themselves and keep them out. He said this was an outrage to everything, and that was the motivation, and that was the reason that they did that. 3 weeks before Bloody Sunday, Robert Ford, who can be seen on the film of Bloody Sunday, standing in William Street as the paratroopers raced into the Bogside, saying, go on the paras, go and get them. He was second in command of the army in the north at the time. He'd been in Derry 3 weeks earlier, and he wrote a memo saying, I believe that the existing army regiments in Derry and the police who are staying out of the Bogside are being too soft. And he believes it may be necessary to shoot selected ringleaders of the Bogside young hooligans, the rioters and so on, in order to restore law and order. That was the thinking that led to the bringing of the parachute regiment to Derry. 5 months previously, and Ford would have known this, the same parachute regiment, when internment without trial was introduced in August 1971, the same parachute regiment were the ones who kicked down doors in West Belfast, arrested people and put them in jail without trial, and when riots began, shot 11 people over 3 days, including a mother of 8 and a Catholic priest who went to the aid of somebody who was wounded. And they lied about it as well. They said they were all gunmen, including the Catholic priest. The same guy who wrote those press releases concocted the same lies about Bloody Sunday. He was a guy called Captain Mike Jackson. He was the second in command of the parachute regiment on the day on the ground in Ireland. He was the guy who sat in the back of an armoured car with every soldier and compiled a lie about what shots they had fired, wrote it all down, put it into a press statement and sent it to the government, which became the official lie. Mike Jackson, and this is what tells you about how it goes to the heart of the British establishment. Mike Jackson not only didn't face trial, he was promoted all the way to the top of the British Army. By the time the British Army were going into Afghanistan and Iraq, Mike Jackson was the chief of the general staff of the British Army, knighted by the Queen and all those sorts of things. When he was forced, and Kate mentioned it, when he was forced in front of the Savile inquiry, he lied through his teeth to the Savile inquiry. Remember, this is the most senior soldier in Britain at the time that he's standing on the stand in Savile. 20 times to the Savile inquiry he said, I do not remember, I do not recall, sorry, can't help you there. When asked about any of the shooting that he witnessed himself on the day, he denied that he knew anything about the so-called shot list that he compiled. even though the inquiry proved it was in his own handwriting and put her in form. He said he just couldn't remember. That's how far up it went. And sorry, I'll try and finish. I know I've sort of gone on a little bit more, but just to emphasise how much the outrage about Bloody Sunday not only impacted Derry, but changed the whole course of events. What Bloody Sunday did was that it terrorised a mass peaceful movement off the streets. That's what it did. My father was in every march between October 1968, the first Civil Rights March in Derry, which was attacked by the police, until Bloody Sunday, and never went on another march again in his life. He used to take us to the rallies at the end. He took us up the day after Bloody Sunday to see, sort of like great pools of blood were burning, the wicked had fallen, and things like that, so that we would remember. And he always wanted us to remember it, but he could never bring himself to march ever again. My uncle's the same, thousands of people like that. And another response to it was that hundreds, if not thousands, were driven into the ranks of the IRA. They said, they're going to shoot us in the streets. We're going to take up arms, and we're going to, at the very least, defend ourselves. Try to go on the back and try to drive Britain out of Ireland, by force of arms. At the same time, the British government things polarised. The British government tried to then develop moderate leaders, sort of the SDLP, that we could, sort of pledge, accept the legitimacy of the state, talk about power sharing, sort of with the unionist parties, the general shape of what's now become the peace process, sort of power sharing arrangement and that sort of thing, while then criminalising the areas, terrorising people, and so on, and cracking down on those things. That is what happened, and that altered the whole course of the next 30 years. They did more than that. They ran murder gangs, undercover, plainclothes murder gangs. They ran loyalist paramilitaries with their agents. It keeps coming out year after year after year now. There's another report came out just 1 week ago about a loyalist paramilitaries in North Derry, just outside of Derry, who committed the most awful crimes, like the Rising Sun Massacre in Grey Steel, where they went into a bar and opened fire. The guns used in that were supplied by British intelligence officers. The guys who ran the unit were British agents and RUC agents, and the collusion just went on. And this is the way in which the British state directed things, shaped things over the next 30 years. That is the lesson that we have to continue to draw about the north of Ireland. And as I say, generalise that to our understanding and build an understanding here in Britain about the nature of the state, because we have to dismantle that and replace it with a fundamentally democratic society. Bloody Sunday, if we understand it in the right way, we should build it into our politics here and build a movement based on that equality, justice, and equality for the future. And here in Britain, I'm sorry, they've gone on so much.